Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Catherine Walsh and I'm the Director of Veterans SA, and welcome to the 7th Community Conversation. I do apologise that we're a few minutes late. We had a technical glitch, but we are flexible and on air now. So I, on behalf of Veterans SA, am delighted to bring this community conversation to you through a live stream, which maximises accessibility for everyone, no matter where they are located. Now, this conversation with my special guest today is also being recorded and will be available on the Veterans SA YouTube channel later this week. So just to recap on the purpose of these community conversations, as I said, this is the 7th one for this year. This is a 2021 initiative that's led by Veterans SA in response to feedback from across the South Australian veteran community, where we identified a thirst for more information about matters of importance and of interest to our community. So we want to make sure, as always, that our content is on point. So if you have any views or suggestions of what we should have for future community conversations, then please email us at veteransa@sa.gov.au. Now, today's topic is how the Defence Innovation Partnership is supporting research for the defence and veteran community, which, if you think about it, is really a continuation of the community conversation that we had last month, which was a panel on grants and what's available across Commonwealth, state and local government. But this month, we're sort of progressing upon that same theme and focusing on where state government is able to fund the research of projects that relate to defence and veteran communities. So a slightly different lens today. From a Veterans SA perspective, we continue to strive to share diverse information to enable informed choice by veterans and their families and their supporters. And we're delighted to bring you something just a little bit different today and give you a peek into the world of academic partnerships and how this research then becomes the backbone of programs and or policy initiatives, both within the government, but also with other key partners across the community. So without further ado, joining me today, it is essentially an in conversation with Suman Rai. So I'd like to welcome Suman to the screen. Hi, Suman.
Hi, Catherine. Thanks very much for this opportunity.
No, thank you for joining us. So I'd just like to give a little bit of an intro of your background and sort of to set the scene before we start our conversation, if that's all right.
Sounds good.
So Suman is the director of the Defence Innovation Partnership and has spent over 15 years working at the intersection of science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and social sciences. So since 2018, Suman has led national and international research and development engagement between researchers, industry and government, and delivered novel initiatives such as the Convergent Series, which we are definitely going to talk about today. And that Convergent Series fosters conversations about major defence and national security challenges through a transdisciplinary perspective and collaboration. We might, we'll talk about that a bit later on. So Suman also supports research, development and innovation activities at Defence SA, which we know is a state government entity, and also through the South Australian Space Industry Centre. Suman has previously been a teacher and a lecturer in arts and design and technology. She's a science communicator and a coordinator of outreach and engagement initiatives, including several open government hackathons, such as the NASA Space Apps Challenge. That is a really wide, diverse, interesting background, Suman, and I'm really looking forward to exploring that some more with you. So welcome.
Thank you very much.
And now, just before we start our questions, I of course want to acknowledge that we meet on the lands, on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and that on our behalf, I pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And I also want to acknowledge the connection of the Kaurna people to the land, the sea and sky. And on our whole behalf, we also share their deep respect for the environment and the country. So, Suman, perhaps we can start with a scene-setting question. It's always a great place to start. The Defence Innovation Partnership, which from now on I'll be talking as DIP, That was launched in 2016 as a collaborative initiative between the Department of Defence, the Defence SA on behalf of state government, and 3 South Australian universities. So can you perhaps help the audience and me to understand, how did that come about? What was the gap that the DIP was going to fill, and maybe a bit of a synopsis of how successful the DIP has been in filling that gap over the last 5 years?
Absolutely. If you think about our member parties, so as you mentioned, we've got Defence, so DSTG is a member party of our organisation, South Australian Government through Defence SA, and the 3 South Australian universities. And they all came to the table with their own sort of requirements and what they wanted to get out of this initiative. But really the 2 sort of founding, I suppose, and members of this organisation were the Commonwealth, DSTG, and the state government through Defence SA. And we both wanted to achieve slightly different things, but they did converge. So from a Commonwealth government perspective and from DSTG's perspective, it was really about getting greater reach through people with local knowledge into the ecosystems of the various states around the country. So obviously DSTG has really great relationships already with researchers and with particularly large industry, so with the primes, but they wanted to be able to engage more closely with researchers they might not be familiar with already, and also with the SME community. So what we provide is essentially that ability for them to reach out into the ecosystem a little bit better. What it also does is we can feed back information that we get from our researchers and from our industry back into DSTG to make them aware of things that they might not otherwise come across. From a South Australian government perspective, so we are an economic development agency, part of Defence SA. We wanted to increase the amount of collaborative defence relevant research and development that happens in South Australia. Now, again, South Australia's had a really long history of doing defence R&D. But what we really wanted to do was to try and increase the profile of that research and development, also attract and retain new researchers into this community. And I'll talk a little bit later on, I think, when we talk about the Convergent Series, about how we're doing this. But we're also sort of expanding what it means to be a defence research and a researcher. So a lot of people who didn't initially consider themselves as defence researchers, weren't sure if their research was of relevance or of interest, are suddenly finding that what they're doing is very much the direction that Defence wants to take in terms of developing capability. So for us, it's about building up the number of people that are working in Defence R&D and trying to attract that funding to South Australia and to the South Australian community.
Great, thanks for that, Suman. Now, I know this isn't in conversation with Suman, but there's obviously a number of people watching this, and you just used a couple of terms that I just wanted to unpack a little bit, if that's okay. So you talked about DSTG, so that's the Defence Science and Technology Group, which is within the Commonwealth Department of Defence, yes?
Yes, so DSTG, Defence Science and Technology Group, as you mentioned, is the research and development arm of the Department of Defence, the Australian Department of Defence. So they provide the research and development, also the advice about procurements that Australian Defence might be making.
Great, okay. And it sounds like that the role the DIP particularly has is as a connector between DSTG and the Commonwealth, and then that local environment, both from a research perspective, but you also use the terms primes and SMEs. Could you just maybe help me clarify what they are?
Absolutely. We get stuck in jargon sometimes. So a prime contractor are the large companies that essentially serve as the main contractors for defence projects. So you're looking at Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, ASC, those sorts of companies. So they're sort of at that level. The SMEs are our small to medium enterprises. So generally the smaller companies that are supplying to these large prime contractors.
Great. Great, thanks for explaining that. I love in particular how you described one of the key things that DIP has done over the last 5 years is expanded what the concept of a defence researcher is and around raising the profile of research. If you'll indulge me for a moment, I used to be on a human research ethics committee for defence and DVA, and certainly when I was interstate, I always used to think that South Australia really hit above its weight in terms of the breadth and quality of research proposals that exist. And that was just through the lens of the veteran community. So, that goes in partnership, and it shows that we have a really rich and solid foundation of research credentials across a multiple of disciplines right here in South Australia. So, I'm a great champion of exactly what you're doing. And I think that there's a real opportunity for us to further promote that in a really positive way about what South Australia does in terms of research and how its effect is not just for South Australia, but actually has a national application too. So, so if we think about then over the last 5 years and what you've described DIP has done, has I guess every entity and organisation evolves. Has the focus of DIP changed a little bit since inception?
Yeah, so we have. So we've recently been through a renewal process with the South Australian government, and we've managed to secure funding for a further 4 years of DIP. And as part of that, we had a review of our activities up to that point, and then also had to develop a bit of a plan for what we were going to do in the next 4 years. So what I would say is that at the first iteration of DIP, we've been really successful at a few things, in particular what we kind of call, building community. So we've, as we've spoken about, sort of expanded, what being a researcher means for defence and also national security. We've run a whole bunch of events where we're connecting people and kind of raising the profile of our researchers here in the state. We also have a fund that we use to fund projects, and so we've managed to build collaborations using that as a bit of a mechanism to kickstart some of these projects. What we want to do in the next 4 years is to build on that work by building some scale around some of the initiatives that we undertake. So while we've been quite broad in the things that we've supported and the work that we do, our next step now is to kind of build a bit more depth and a bit more scale to build some larger projects, around the areas of strategic interest for the state. The other thing which I'm really excited about, which we're going to be able to do over the next 4 years, is to first of all identify and then help build and deliver on some foresighting work. So we really want to see where the state is going to be, sort of in the next 30 years, and then to build some projects around, how we actually make that come to fruition.
Fantastic. Now, you mentioned around funding, and that's a really targeted flagship program that exists as part of DIP, the Collaborative Research Fund grants round. And particularly with the vision about building upon the strategic initiatives that are important to the state. Could you maybe talk us through a little bit more about the Collaborative Research Fund and the sorts of research projects that you have funded to date? Now, I also note you've got a great website, and we'll make sure that that comes up on the screen a little bit later so people can find more information outside of this conversation. But yeah, maybe could you step us through about that, and if there's any success stories that you'd like to share?
Sure. Yeah, so our Collaborative Research Fund has been our key mechanism to kind of create these collaborations and make them happen and sort of kickstart some of these conversations that people might have been having. Essentially, we provide up to $150,000 for collaborative research projects, which we have some criteria around what we sort of classify as a project that fits into this. And generally, it's around having sort of multiple universities, industry partner, and defence participation or some kind of involvement. So generally speaking, the successful projects will have, say, 2 or more South Australian universities working together with an industry partner or a translation partner. Sometimes we find that having an industry partner is not the the most appropriate way of going about it. We fund some social sciences projects, for example, where there's not an obvious industry partner. So we use the term translation partner. And then either DSTG being involved directly through providing a little bit of funding or having staff work on the project, or providing some support by letting us know that this is something that fits with their sort of strategic plans, and they'd be interested to see the outcomes of the projects. So we, like I said, we fund up to 150K, but the value of our projects is actually a lot more, because we want to see genuine collaboration between the parties involved in the projects. So they will also provide both cash and in-kind contributions, and in-kind contributions can be anything from staff time to access to equipment or infrastructure, things like that. So we've had 4 rounds of our collaborative research fund to date. In fact, we're right in the middle of doing assessments for round 5. This is a great time of year because you get to read some amazing applications from our research community, and you see, as you mentioned before, Catherine, the breadth of research that exists in the state is quite astounding. So we've had 4 rounds, and we funded 20 projects over those 4 rounds. And yeah, we have had some real success stories. And when you look at the fund, we on purpose, we didn't go out with a list of things that we were looking for each round. We, of course, tell our researchers that, applicants that what they propose should be desirable for defense, but that can be informed in a number of ways. So if there is direct involvement from a DSTG staff member, for example, a DSTG researcher, then yeah, we know there's interest there. There's a desirability factor there, because otherwise they wouldn't invest. They can also be guided by some of the strategic documents that exist. So it could be Defense's Science and Technology Plan that was released last year, or it could be any of the sort of domain-specific S&T plans, which also exist. And then, of course, there are lists like, for example, the Next Generation Technologies Fund, which is a Defense Science and Technology Group fund, which has a number of themes. There is the Defense Innovation Hub, which also releases themes that they're interested in sort of on a yearly basis. And then now there's also Starshots, which are sort of larger missions, essentially, that Defense Science and Technology Group wants to focus its research along. So we make sure that the community knows about that, but we don't go out with our own lists. And what that helps us to do is to identify what already exists in the community that is of relevance to defense. There's a whole bunch of things that we wouldn't have uncovered if we had gone out with what we assumed were the things that that defense wanted. So that's been a really interesting activity and exercise. So we found from there a number of different types of success stories. So you've got the more traditional technology development success stories, which I'll explain in a bit more detail in a moment. And then we've got ones which, if you'd come to us in the first round of our collaborative research fund, we pretty much talked commercialization and not translation more generally. So we were kind of focused more on the technology development side of things, which meant that we were missing out on some really, really good research that would inform training, policy, health and well-being outcomes. So we did actually change our terminology a little bit for the second round to allow more of these projects to be funded. So say, for example, with a technology success story, we have a company here in South Australia called Duke Systems, and they came to us with a proposal to build an EW, so electronic warfare sensor system, which they wanted to put onto a satellite. So in order to do that, there are a whole bunch of systems that you have to develop and then miniaturize so that you can actually put it on a small satellite that's going to be in orbit. So that was the problem that they were trying to solve. They came to us and had defined phase 1 of this project, which they called MOS, so Miniaturized Orbital EW Sensor System. But they had plans for the next stage. And the next stage was going to the Defense Innovation Hub to secure additional funding to be able to further develop their system. So what our funding allowed them to do was to build their research team. So the university, 2 universities themselves and defense, and to test out and to prototype some of these subsystems for the satellite. So they managed to develop a proof of concept, which got them to a stage and put them in a really good position to win an additional $3 million from the Defense Innovation Hub to actually continue work. Now, they've kind of reached almost the end of that phase as well. So they're working out what to do now for phase 3. But that, in my mind, is more of that traditional kind of pathway where you are developing a piece of technology and you're taking it up through the, what we call the technology readiness level scale, or TRL scale, to make it ready to be deployed and commercialized. If you look at something that is a little less technology focused, so we have another really interesting project which came to us from the University of South Australia, and it was looking at how we could use language and interviews that these researchers did with, in this case, the small group was mothers who'd been deployed to the Middle East area of operations. So they did a whole bunch of interviews with them, and they wanted to see if they could detect the impacts of stigma, but through the way that language was being used by these women. So that was an interesting one where there's not a clear commercialization outcome, right? So what they found was really interesting. They found that you could detect the impacts of stigma by listening to the way people speak. They found that their use of language, was a little bit, they weren't using as many different types of words. They were using pauses in really interesting moments. And that was consistent with, in the larger population, how people speak when they are suffering from, anxiety or depression. So this is a really interesting new way of trying to determine whether someone who's returned from operations might be going through something that they might not be able to articulate to sort of, explain what they might be going through or what they might be feeling. So that one was done in partnership with what was then called the Road Home and is now called the Military and Emergency Services Health Australia, MESHA. Which is, again, another research institute, a very sort of translational research institute. So, we're hoping that the findings of this study will actually be able to inform the way that that people sort of, especially psychologists and so on, practice. But there's another interesting outcome, which is how the use of language can actually allow us to understand very quickly how people see themselves in relation to their peers. So whether there are in-groups and out-groups being created in certain communities. So yeah, there's a lot of really interesting implications from this work, but not what you would call a traditional kind of technology development and commercialization path.
Thanks, Suman. And I think that really goes also to the question I asked at the beginning around how has the DIP evolved over the last 5 years? And certainly a number of the case studies that you have on your website are very much about that technical project, which now that makes sense because you identified that the initial focus was commercialization, but you've learned along the way, not just governed by the priorities of the Commonwealth and as well as state strategic priorities, but where those gaps are starting to be and where the value add of seed funding is. So I love both of those stories, with the MOAS one that the DIP was involved in seed funding, and then for that success to be proven to access $3 million from the Defence Innovation Hub is just such a great success story. And then seeing increasingly, and I know from our conversations outside of this, is that you are seeing more of those social sciences and I guess what I'd probably call human factors research, and what that looks like for the defence population or for the veteran population, but also then how that sits in in the context of the general population as well, as that point of comparison to be able to inform policy and programs. So that's really interesting. Thanks for giving us sort of both sides of that. But there's something I wanted to ask. You talked about the mothers who deployed to the Middle East proposal, and that was a partnership between UniSA and Mesha. So I guess my question is, you must receive a number of applications on an annual basis for the Collaborative Research Fund. Do they all need to be, as part of that collaboration, need to be with one of the 3 South Australian universities, or how do you how do you engage with maybe a consortia of interstate or foreign universities, or entities like Mesha, which are not tertiary institutions, but are, you know, very credible research foundations in their own right? How does that bit work?
Yeah, we do collaborate with institutions outside of our 3 universities, absolutely. So I think there's a difference between who the funding is provided to and who the team ends up being in terms of who they work with. So we don't put any restrictions, I guess, in terms of how the team is built. So it can include interstate and international partners. There's no issue with that. But because we were established to encourage collaboration within or between South Australian entities, there are some minimum requirements for that collaboration in order for a proposal to be successful. So pretty much you do have to have sort of 2 South Australian universities. If it's an industry-led sort of a project, then obviously we want that industry partner to be based in South Australia. And then again, you still do have that university requirement to be competitive, really, in the round. But that being said, we've had some really great collaborations with interstate universities and industry partners. And there have been a couple of interesting kind of links with international parties as well. But I mean, that's just our funding, right? So our funding is one part of what we do. And I see it more as an enabler of our real task or our real job, which is making those connections. And we often can find other ways of sourcing funding for people to undertake their work. And in fact, sometimes we find that the biggest problem is not so much the funding, but the fact that people don't have the time to really figure out what else is going on in the state or in the country or even internationally, particularly when you look at these small to medium enterprises who are just, you know, they're going on and they're doing their jobs, and they don't often have like a person who's dedicated to doing horizon scanning to figure out what else might be going on in the ecosystem. So we play that part of enabling that sort of information sharing and those connections. So in terms of international and national partnerships, we are actually a part of a national network. So we have like organizations in Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, and WA. So essentially the whole country is covered. So Tasmania and the Northern Territory and the ACT work with all of us as well. We're all covered, and what links us is that all of us have a full-time DSTG staff member embedded in our organizations. So these people are called our associate directors, and they form a national network, and they talk to each other on a daily basis, sharing information where it makes sense about what's going on in their states and in their what they're seeing in the universities and so on, to see if we can make some national connections. Because really, from DSTG's perspective, they want the best team wherever that team comes from. So it doesn't really matter to them if they're South Australian or not. So that's where we've got this interesting tension between the national and the state-based kind of partners. It's a good tension. It's not a bad tension. So we're working together as a national group. And that also means that, we have connections into national, so interstate industry and so on when we need it. And we do the same for our partners from interstate. Internationally, we're building relationships with our sort of Five Eyes partners, as you would expect. So we've got some good connections with the UK already through their universities, and also through organizations like ours that exist to do similar functions in the UK. So there's one in particular called the UK Defence Solutions Centre. We were sort of before COVID trying to work out how we might be able to encourage international research collaborations. But yeah, I'm hoping we revisit that, once things are a little bit easier for us to kind of travel and to work internationally in that way. The US also, they have local representatives of Army, Navy, and Air Force research labs. So they're very forthcoming in working with us to where we do identify some really interesting things that might be of interest to them. We will share that information with them, and they do the same with us because they're looking for really good research and development partnerships. So yeah, we do have those connections, and we work with those connections quite closely. Obviously, we want to see our researchers and our industry expand their reach so that they're not just, working within South Australia, they're going national and international.
Wow. So I'm hearing in your language that there are the main role that the DIP has, and thank you for refocusing us away from just the annual grants program, because often we can become quite focused on that, but really a strong role in being connectors, translators, and almost navigators of the system, because you have that helicopter view and you're able to make those introductions and to sort of pose hypotheses around, hey, your research proposal is really interesting. Have you thought about marrying it up with this particular, on the face of it, unassociated discipline? Can I introduce you to the researchers, and you go on your way and see where it takes you. So I think that's a really important piece that you've just highlighted, that it's not just around what the state government actually then funds, but it's those lasting, durable interpersonal connections across the states, as well as bringing together an already close and collaborative academic community even more so. So thanks for reminding me on that. Also, you did in your earlier example talk about the breadth of research that has been coming forward, and I guess I would like to really sort of spotlight on the veteran community, given that's our primary audience. But before I ask my next question, we are live streaming, and the opportunity exists for anybody who's watching us right now to put a question in the chat box if you have any for Suman. They pop up for me, and we can make sure that your questions are answered. So please keep them flowing through, and we've got sort of another 20 so minutes where we can include those questions as well. But until I see the next one, I've got another one for you, Suman. So focusing on the veteran community, and as you said, DIP's got a pretty broad church in terms of focus. How do you assess the value to the community of some of the research that you support, both from a funding perspective, but also around the veracity of you give credibility by making those connections in the research community? And how do you feel assurance around the fact that that DIP is then being distinguished from, say, other established veteran research funding models that exist out there?
That's a really good question. It's actually something we are actively considering as we go forward in the next 4 years. So again, this is one of those things where we've been set up, the model that we've been set up in or for, I guess, hasn't explicitly included, so the veterans community in that way, but there are some very specific research proposals and conversations that we've had with our researchers where it might not neatly fit our current sort of funding guidelines necessarily, but we still want to include that because for us, that is part of our defense state story. And, the fact that as Defence Innovation Partnership, we work alongside Defence SA, South Australian Space Industry Centre, and Veterans SA. We want to get better at doing this. So right now, I guess we're not trying to distinguish ourselves as such from existing research funders for veterans research and development. We want to work alongside them, and where there is potentially a gap, we might be able to play a part. So right now, the stuff that we've funded tends to sit at in that area where we do have buy-in from DSTG. So this is research that could be applied to more than strictly what the researcher originally thought their research was going to do. So for example, as we spoke about with the language and stigma research, the ability to identify how, during interviews, how people are really feeling based on the way they use language is also of interest to social analysts, for example, that sit in DSTG. So that was the DSTG buy-in that we got, but obviously we had Mesha involved, so we knew that this was, kind of a bit of research that could be applied in multiple ways. We also are very, well linked, because we have this relationship with the universities, to various transition programs that exist in the sort of the 3 universities to get veterans into higher education. So that's another sort of area where we're sitting alongside, not really, not competing with, but just sort of, watching and learning. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of other providers as well that fit into this ecosystem. So for us, if a proposal comes to us that looks at, for example, service families. So we've had a couple of researchers who have come to us from both UniSA and Flinders University, looking at the impact of, having a spouse who is part of the ADF, and how the implications of that for families who are moving around, trying to establish careers, those sorts of implications. Currently, there's really no easy way for us to directly fund that project, but because of our close relationship with Mesha, we know that there is already a research network that's been set up to look at families in that situation. So we would make that introduction and try and assist our researchers who come to us to be able to access funding from elsewhere. The other thing I would say is, so I've been talking, I guess, mainly about veterans who've left the ADF and how we kind of support them after they've left. We also want to, I guess, acknowledge that more and more the research we're seeing coming, through our doors is very focused on the human in the system. So you're almost, you're looking at the veterans community while they're still operators, or while they're still in the ADF, and trying to ensure that they have the best support while they're actually, while they're still in the ADF. So that can be anything from one of our research projects, for example, is about trying to unobtrusively measure, so detect, measure, and manage the effects of stress, and particularly stress under different levels of fatigue. So the actual question came to this researcher from the AFP, so the Australian Federal Police, and the scenario that they were looking at was people who were constantly, as part of their job, having to view distressing images. And of course, you can see the kind of the corollary, I guess, or in defense, where particularly as we have sort of drone operators and so on being quite removed from the actual area where they're operating and having to view this imagery. So what our researcher was trying to do was to develop a way of being able to detect and mitigate some of these, the way that people react to stress, and be able to detect those reactions relatively early so that they could be managed relatively early before it became a real problem. So that's one example, for example, where we're kind of looking at the operator and trying to make sure they have the best experience that they can have in that situation. Another one is, for example, using artificial intelligence to help, again, operators make good decisions, again, under different levels of stress and fatigue. So if we're looking at, people on a submarine, for example, as an extreme case, you might not be sleeping very well. The lighting isn't right to kind of, make sure your circadian rhythms aren't thrown out of whack. It can be incredibly stressful. You're under close quarters with a whole bunch of other people. So there's interpersonal relationships to deal with. There are a whole bunch of different factors. So how do you make sure that, essentially the submarine systems are detecting how you're feeling and then presenting information to you in a way that allows you to make the best, quick, decisions, knowing that you're kind of, under all of this pressure and under all of this stress. So that's about, again, supporting the operator and making sure that, they are kind of operating at their peak in difficult circumstances. So I guess to answer your question, we're still playing, very much in that field where there's probably a direct interest from DSTG and the ADF, rather than in the space where we're sort of supporting veterans after they've left, or they're transitioning, or their health and well-being afterwards. In that space, we already know that there are existing initiatives, and we want to work alongside those to make sure that our researchers have a way of getting the best research and informing practice.
Wonderful. And I need to thank you and acknowledge, Suman, that the veterans community it includes those who are currently serving, those who are reservists, those who are no longer wearing the uniform, and their families. So that's, I think there's some really clear illustrative points there around, it's not just those who've left the military, and it sounds like very much is around that social sciences and human factors piece, but that to be in the Defence Force, you are part of a system, and making sure that there is an acknowledgement of how to improve that, and enabling people to perform even better and more effectively to do the job that they need to do in defence. And you also talked about then how that has application in the wider community as well. And if you think about it, defence, regardless of which country you're on, has always been the leading edge of a lot of those technological and social discoveries and research across time. So this is just another example of it. So thanks for calibrating us on that. Now, I do want to use my favorite word, which is pivot. I want to move away from discussing the collaborative research grants and those partnerships that you've talked extensively about. In the introduction, I talked about the Convergent Series. Now, innovation is a word that is part of your title, the Defence Innovation Partnership. And to me, the Convergent Series is a true example of the innovative approaches that your team takes in bringing people together that seemingly are from unrelated disciplines, from academics to just interested and informed members of the general public, to come together and to share ideas about some really cool topics that are complex defence problems, maybe not quite wicked problems, but also around security, national security challenges as well. What really struck with me is when we were talking last week, and you had your last
Convergent Series.
Thank you. I was thinking I was going to say episode in the Convergent Series, which was premised on something that was really wild for me. And that was broadly around encouraging military practitioners to read science fiction, which is characterized by alternate futures, and by incorporating this into military planning and thinking to preempt the seemingly fantastical. Now, can you tell us about the Convergent Series? Where do you discover these really engaging and seemingly, as I said, fantastical topics to start with, but you don't have to scratch the surface very hard to see the complexity of that and the bringing of a variety of views, which is, I guess, the richness and the challenge of it. And then maybe you can give us a sneak peek of when your next one is as well.
Yeah, sure. So I'm really excited about the Convergent series, and it's unique to us. So, I said we have a national network, but this is one that, sort of we did literally just kind of read a report, which was put out by MIT a few years ago, where they were talking about how traditionally disparate disciplines, when they are not forced, but they're encouraged to work together, can create brand new disciplines. So in their example, it was looking at life sciences and health sciences and computer science, right? So generally in a university setting, you would have these departments in completely different buildings, different side of the campus. They might never speak to each other. But when you put them together, you get new insights through things like bioinformatics. So that, bioinformatics kinds of underpins a lot of the health and medical research that we're doing today. But it wouldn't have existed without the ability for us to crunch that big data, which the computer sciences brought to us. So we took that concept and we said, well, can we look at very, very challenging, very complex problems, global problems that have a defense and national security implication to them. And literally, because we are connectors, as you mentioned earlier, we sit at the nexus of all of these different organizations and we know a lot of people. Can we try and identify people from a range of different sectors, a range of different disciplines, and a range of levels, everything from, undergrads at university, all the way through to very senior defense, military personnel, and, professors, senior professors in universities, for example, or CEOs of companies, right? Whoever is interested. Can we identify them, invite them specifically to a session like this, and just try and make some new introductions? Now, eventually, we want to see that these introductions have resulted in some kind of research collaboration or, partnership or whatever it might be. But the task for these events is very simple. As I tell the audience, there's really two things that they need to achieve, and I'll be happy. One of which is to speak to someone you've never spoken to before. And secondly, to have a conversation that you weren't expecting to have. And that tends to happen because we do want these to be in-person events. So while it's absolutely wonderful to hold things where you can increase the reach and the access of your sessions. This one doesn't work unless people are in the same room. So in 2020, we didn't have any sessions. So we started in 2019. We looked at things like complex systems, human-centered intelligence systems. So again, this comes back to what I was saying earlier about the focus on the human being within the larger platform or the larger system. And having, your AI or whatever it might be, actually working to optimize the performance and the well-being of the human in the center. Also things like human machine and human autonomous teaming, for example, is a really interesting emerging topic that we were looking at. So that was a really interesting 2019. We were just piloting it to see if the concept worked, and it seemed to. We've had anecdotally some really good outcomes that people have come to me and just said, I met someone at the session who I wouldn't otherwise have met, and now they're helping me find the right people to work with for my research project, or introducing me to a community, for example, that I wouldn't have had access to previously for the research that I'm doing. So we know that it works, and we get people who come back for sort of multiple sessions, and we see them almost being champions for us and bringing in ideas from previous sessions into the current session. So like I said, we ran the sessions in 2019 and they seemed to work. We put it on hiatus for 2020. We started again this year. So far we've run a session on space security. So again, looking at everything from the technology that's going to help us detect objects in space and track objects in space, all the way through to international law and what kind of norms exist for us to respond to a potential perceived threat or an attack or whatever it might be in the space domain. So really wide range of people who were involved in that conversation. So that was really great. The second one we ran was about national security implications of climate change. And that allowed us to bring in an entire community who didn't even know who the Defense Innovation Partnership was, because we were targeting people who had been more focused on the environmental side of things, or responses to the bushfires, for example. So we got to speak to an entirely new community. But then, of course, defense was still in the room as well, because as we know, the involvement of defense in these sorts of responses is kind of increasing, right? So if you put bushfires and COVID-19 response, for example, we can see the impacts of that on defense. So that was a really interesting session as well. And we've had some really good outcomes in terms of new relationships that were built from that session. And then, like you say, the last one was an interesting one. We came up with this idea in 2019. We weren't sure how it was going to go down, whether people would be interested. Like you say, it felt a little bit out there for us. But it turns out this has been going on for a while, and people have been interested in this concept of using science fiction or fiction more generally as a way of hypothesizing, creating alternative visions of the future, whether that's the near future, so that's stuff that we can sort of conceivably say might happen, or we're using these space operas and space epics to let our imaginations go a little bit wild and try and work out what the future might look like in 100 years or 200 years from now. We had an amazing response to this particular session. The group that were the audience were the most diverse we've ever had, like I said, in terms of their areas of interest as well as levels. Again, everybody has some kind of story or some kind of hook, not just into science fiction, but fiction more generally. I think that's somehow how we contextualize our lives in a way. So everyone had a story to tell. Everyone had something that they wanted to talk about, which was amazing. Our panelists were also really interesting. It was kind of headed up by Major General Mick Ryan, who is the commander of the Australian Defence College. And he is a huge advocate of using fiction and narrative as a way of visualizing and creating scenarios about what the near future might look like, and then those scenarios can then inform war gaming and planning and all those sorts of sort of outcomes from that. So he had an amazing presentation. Unfortunately, it had to be virtual because he's in Canberra, but that did allow us to have our first international panelist as well, from the University of Liverpool in the UK. I guess he found us and contacted us, and we had a look at his research, and it was very much in line with what we were looking at, just sort of how humans and technology interact, and he was using the medium of science fiction to explore those themes. So yeah, as it turns out, it's not as out there as I had originally imagined, but it has generated a lot of interest, and it's a really exciting topic because it kind of underpins, where we go next, and it has implications for our organization as well, because we ourselves are trying to work out where we go next in terms of the scale that we're trying to build in South Australia. So we need to figure out our guideposts and where we want to end up in terms of the research and development capability we want to build in South Australia. That is foresighting. I'm hoping that we can get some creative thinkers and some writers involved in some of our foresighting studies, so that we can get some of that creativity in there and show that it does work. So yeah, very excited about that. Sorry, I could talk about this for hours. But the last part of your question was about the next session. Now, I don't have a date yet, but that's an excuse for everyone to jump onto our website and keep an eye out on our socials, which I'll come to in a minute. But it will be in November, and the theme is off the grid. So basically, we're looking at sustainable operating bases. So whether that's a military forward operating base, for example, or it could have implications for remote area communities, or it could have some implications for what we might do when we finally end up going to the moon and then eventually to Mars. So we want to look at things like architecture. So how do you design habitats or living spaces which suit the humans in them. We want to look at energy sources. So, whether we're moving to hydrogen or solar or wind or whatever it might be, what is that mix that we need in order to be sustainable? Everything down to even, the kind of food that we can preserve or grow in those kind of self-sustaining environments. And again, you can see how that would have implications for space exploration as well. So we tie in really closely with the aims of the South Australian Space Industry Centre and the space strategy in terms of using our existing knowledge about how to grow crops and how to modify crops to grow in resource constrained environments, so low water, high salinity, those sorts of things, and apply them for both space exploration and also to improve the way that we utilize space and grow food here on Earth. So that one's going to be really interesting. We'll have some involvement from the Andy Thomas Centre for Space Resources at Adelaide Uni. Obviously, all the researchers that are involved in that centre also do work for applications here on Earth. So that should be a really interesting discussion. And yeah, hopefully we can feed that back into the conversation that Defence is having, both locally and also internationally. We know they're interested in this.
And Suman, I love the Convergent series of how it challenges and encourages both hemispheres of the brain, the left and the right, and just seeing where it takes you. And particularly the science fiction one, which I did identify as being a particularly intriguing and inspiring one for me. If I think about my former life as an Air Force intelligence officer, of course, joint military appreciation planning is around developing courses of action, which are the most likely and the most dangerous, and really being able to open up one's mind around what could seem fantastical, but actually is still possible in that suite of options that you then narrow down for briefing your commander. So I love that approach. And as I said, it's truly inspiring to see these innovative ways of encouraging thinking and in problem solving as well. So I guess you did flag that, and I can see from the time it's almost time to wrap. So you've covered a lot of ground today. There's so many things that are happening in the space of academic research, which has application in the defence and the veterans communities, as well as those connecting, navigating, partnering with researchers for the benefits now and into the future. Now, you do have a website. I'm going to read it to make sure I get it correct. So people can find more information on www.defenceinnovationpartnership.com, and it's there on your screen. But you also talked about that you've got social media, and do you have a mailing list that people can subscribe to when they're inspired after today?
Sure. So there's a few different ways. We don't have a specific mailing list as such. So you can find us on Twitter at dip_South-Aust. Just search for us. I'm sure you'll find us. You can find us on LinkedIn by searching for Defence Innovation Partnership. So those are our primary ways that we communicate about what is going on, what events we might be holding, any funding schemes that might be open that people should be interested in, and then also telling some of the stories of our researchers and our research. So we do really great short videos that describe some of the projects that we've funded. Really easy way to get a snapshot of what the gist of the project was, but also the collaboration and how that worked. So Twitter and LinkedIn. We also have the option, if people are interested in our Convergent series, to send us an email just letting us know you're interested. And basically, once we've got you on that Convergent series list, we'll send out invites to future ones so that you can keep sort of up to date with what's going on. So yeah, those are the easiest ways to get in touch. And then, as always, if you go on the website, you'll find our email addresses and so on. We're always happy to sit down and have a chat to people.
Fantastic. So there's so many ways that people can connect, either actively or keep a bit of a watching brief and then engage with there's a topic of interest. So there's that website again, which is www.defenceinnovationpartnership.com. And then you can also find the DIP on Twitter and on LinkedIn as well. So, well, thank you for such an inspiring conversation today, Suman. I always enjoy having a chat with you. Now, I'd just like to say to our audience, because our community conversations are monthly and they're on the last Tuesday of every month, there is an exception. We won't be having a community conversation next month in October, and that's because the Premier has his annual town hall on the 20th of October, so the week before. We will be live streaming that. There will be face-to-face down at the Torrens Training Depot, and you can visit our website, which is veteranssa.sa.gov.au, or email us at veteranssa@sa.gov.au. You can have a look on our website homepage for more details about the Premier's Town Hall and how you can register as well. So that will be next month on the 20th of October. There will not be a community conversation for October. So with that community service announcement out of the way, I'd like to bring you back Suman Rai. I knew I'd get it wrong. Sorry, Suman Rai, who is the director of the Defence Innovation Partnership. And thank you so much for this on the couch conversation, just you and me. It's been really fabulous. And thank you for your time and sharing your great depth of knowledge and your palpable enthusiasm about all things innovation. So on everybody's behalf, thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to getting some more updates in the future as well, Suman.
Thanks very much, Catherine. It was great.
All right. Thanks so much. And thank you to our audience who have tuned into the live stream today. This will be available on the Veterans SA YouTube channel by the end of the week. And there's also a back catalogue of our other community conversations as well, if you wanted to learn anything further. So my name is Catherine Walsh. I'm the Director of Veterans SA, and we look forward to seeing you for the next community conversation in November.